I have been a fan of Godzilla and the wider kaiju genre for nearly my entire life. It's one of those few franchises from my childhood that I can still vividly remember being introduced to. I can remember being shown King Kong vs. Godzilla, thinking that it was the be-all and end-all of Godzilla at the time. I can remember asking why Godzilla was frozen in ice, not knowing that he was trapped there at the end of Godzilla Raids Again. I can remember seeing Godzilla 98, thinking that it was just as official a production and the only other Godzilla content that was available, even if it was never able to stick with me in the same way as the dumb rubber-suited monsters had before it. I can remember the years passing, going to my friend's house and playing Godzilla Save the Earth for the first time. I can remember being shocked by the massive collection of various kaiju characters to choose from, eventually getting the game for myself and playing it to death, never realizing that it was a representation of something larger, a wider mythos of characters that weren't just unique to my PlayStation 2. I can remember my obsession skyrocketing, and my love for what I thought were just video game characters reaching their peak. I can remember trying to find Godzilla clips in the early days of YouTube, and stumbling across Cinemassacre's Godzillathon, mind blown by the fact that so much more films existed, and that all of the monsters I'd grown to love had battled Godzilla on the big screen just like King Kong had all those years earlier. I can remember rushing to tell my friends. I can remember begging my parents to buy me one of the films. I can remember eventually getting Godzilla vs. Gigan on VHS, the titular monster, the one I would always play as the most. I can remember seeing the trailer for Terror of Mechagodzilla before the main feature, and seeing Titanosaurus use his tail to cause hurricane-level winds as Mechagodzilla stood within a colossal wall of flames, causing my urge to see more of the films to surge to newfound heights that I can't even begin to explain. I can remember Godzilla vs. Gigan finally starting and watching it over and over again, my childlike mind unable to see how awful a Godzilla film it really was.
Something funny going on. You better check. Oh, yeah. Hurry up.
Too amazed that both Anguirus and King Ghidorah were in a film that I thought would only have included Gigan. I can remember the years passing, and discovering just how hard it was to find the films which may as well have been mythical artifacts in the UK. My only proof of their existence being the trailers I had seen and the discussions I had found online. I can remember trying to find uploads of them online, and even then finding it impossible to find anything. I can remember hearing that a new film was being made by Hollywood, one that aimed to be more truthful to the source material than whatever they had made in the 90s. I can remember seeing it in the cinema, being too blown away by the fact that I was seeing one of my favourite monsters on the big screen for the first time, and looking past its flaws in the same way I had done with Godzilla vs. Gigan before it.
Hey, Akira, come on! There's a lot of trouble ahead!
I can remember finally finding ways to watch the Japanese films online, finally satisfying my urge for more of what I had become so infatuated with. I can remember Godzilla suddenly becoming a household name, and when Toho decided to release Shin Godzilla in Western theatres. I can remember being hopeful that this franchise might finally go mainstream, that it might finally be accessible to everyone for the first time. I can remember seeing Godzilla Minus One on the big screen, and being brought to tears by a franchise I never thought I would. Godzilla Minus One is a film that somehow surpassed all of my insanely high expectations. I'm not going to lie to you, I hate the Monsterverse. Well, most of it. I think Skull Island is a fun action flick, and I enjoy parts of Gareth Edwards' film. I also think the action in both King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong is pretty well done, even if I think they are both god-awful films. And in my eyes, none of them hold a candle to what Guillermo del Toro did with Pacific Rim. But I'm not here to talk about the Monsterverse, although I might do that later down the line. The only reason I mentioned it at all is because before Hollywood got their hands on the brand in 2014, the wider Godzilla franchise was in another one of its dry spells. Sure, I said in my opening that I hadn't really seen a whole lot of Japanese Godzilla by that point, but I'd seen enough to be aware of it, and enough to be able to compare what Legendary was giving us to what it was inspired by, even if it was difficult to find those films to begin with. But in the 10 years since the Monsterverse began, I still feel that the people behind it have no idea what makes this genre work, a fact that was proven in 2016. I don't think I will ever forget the hype I had for Shin Godzilla. to finally be able to see a Japanese-made film without having to jump through hoops to get there was a dream come true. By that point I had some time to reflect on Gareth Edwards' film, and had developed a distaste for it since my initial viewing. I hated how it was scared to show its monsters, how terrified it felt of embracing the genre it was adapting, how it cut away every time the action was just about to begin to news broadcasts showing its aftermath. I hated how, despite Bryan Cranston being the most interesting part of the film and the driving force behind its marketing material, that he was killed off and replaced with some other bland and all the more forgettable character. Fast forward to Shin Godzilla, and it seems like Japan had come back to the monster movie game with a vengeance. Hideaki Anno, creator of Neon Genesis Evangelion, arrived with a passionate goal to inject new life into 3 of his favourite franchises. Enter Shin Godzilla, a movie bursting with style, tension, and fear. A movie so chaotic that even its characters couldn't stay in the same room for more than a second. A movie that reminded us what Godzilla originally was, an allegory for nuclear war and the unstoppable force of nature. Shin Godzilla was everything the 2014 film should have been, and felt like Toho was throwing the rulebook onto the table just to show Hollywood how it was done. There was hope that the Godzilla franchise, the real Godzilla franchise, was back, and I couldn't wait for more. Years passed, and a sequel never happened, but to be honest, it didn't need to. Shin Godzilla was always a one and done, and as cool as it would have been to see new interpretations of Godzilla's rogues gallery and its creepy mutated art style, I'm glad we didn't. Sometimes a good thing just needs to remain a good thing. No need to add to it for the sake of adding to it. In the years that followed Shin's release, Legendary continued to make films. Kong Skull Island came out a year later, and King of the Monsters 2 years after that, both showcasing that they really didn't know how to write compelling narratives relating to these giant monsters. King of the Monsters doing all it could to cut away and focus on its god-awful drivel about eco-terrorists and magic boxes that can control kaiju as much as possible. King of the Monsters may have nailed its action. It may have partially nailed the excitement of the Showa era, and expertly updated the look and feel of Ghidorah, Mothra and Rodan, but when 95% of your movie is awful, I'm not going to care for it. 2 years later, Godzilla vs. Kong was upon us. The rematch of the century, and the remake of the first Godzilla film I ever saw. We were coming full circle. The trailers made it look like mayhem, a monster rumble for the ages. It looked like we were getting what we always wanted, a chaotic versus movie that was even more inspired by the early eras of the franchise than whatever their last few attempts had been. But, to nobody's surprise, I hated it. And I still haven't seen its sequel because of that fact. Its characters were somehow worse than its predecessor, and its story somehow even more nonsensical. Look, I know that Toho's Godzilla has been pretty nonsensical in the past, but at least with those outings, I haven't been bored out of my mind. Yes, Godzilla vs. Kong's action may have been great, but again, I'm not giving a film props just because less than a quarter of it is entertaining. Before I move on, I want to reaffirm that yes, there is bad Japanese Godzilla films. In fact, there's some really bad Japanese Godzilla films. But even then, Toho understands the genre. Even then, they don't shy away from showing you what you wanted to see in the first place. No matter how wacky the series gets, Toho always seems to approach it with legitimacy. They aren't embarrassed by what they're making, and they understand how to use these monsters in a compelling way. If Toho made a film about the Hollow Earth, for example, I doubt they would take the concept as seriously as they did in GVK. In short, the Monsterverse is a disjointed mess. One without focus, and without vision, that doesn't understand what it's adapting, and takes itself far too seriously. Well, seriously by kaiju standards anyway. But even then, they're making money. And don't get me wrong, I have no problem with people enjoying those films. I'm happy that people are finding love for this franchise, regardless of where they get it from. But no matter what I think, the Monsterverse is popular, extremely popular, and with Godzilla more well known than ever, why wouldn't Toho try again? It's late 2022, and Godzilla Minus One is officially announced, its title being revealed in July the following year. 2 months later, we get our first trailer, and all I could say was, wow. We were going back in time. back even further than the original Godzilla film, back to the immediate aftermath of World War II in Japan. It looked incredible. Godzilla, whilst still not represented in the traditional rubber suit, looked stunning, a brilliant reinterpretation of his classic look. All I could do was wait. So I did. I waited, and waited, and waited. More trailers dropped, and I continued to wait, certain that what we were about to get would be the real deal. More of what Shin Godzilla had given us 7 years prior. Finally, the film came out. I rushed to the cinema. I got my ticket, took my seat, waited through the adverts, the trailers, through the requests to turn off my phone, until finally it started. And all I could say by the time it was finished was, wow. Just wow. As the credits rolled on Minus One, I was in tears. Like, literal tears. I had gone in expecting a Godzilla movie, expecting more of what I had already grown to love over the course of my life, expecting more of what I loved about Shin Godzilla, or maybe even the original movie. Instead, I got something far beyond that, something that I never expected. I got the story about a man, a veteran, so haunted by his past that he feels his own death is the only way to make up for it. We are introduced to our protagonist, Koichi, during the final days of World War II. As a kamikaze pilot, he is honour-bound to kill himself for his emperor, but for reasons we are yet to learn, he finds himself unable to go through with it. Almost immediately, he comes under fire for abandoning his duty. Tachibana, another one of our core characters, implying that he is lying about his commitment to the cause. Keep a note of this, because I'll come back to it later. However, in the exact same sequence, we see Koichi approached by another engineer, one that tells him that he agrees with his decision. This is our first representation of the inner conflict Koichi will face throughout the rest of the film, and in my opinion, it's very subtly done, even if it is said to you outright. But again, I'll come back to it later. I could sit here and tell you that Godzilla's first scene was amazing, that the visual effects are incredible for the tiny budget the production had at its disposal. But instead, I just want to talk about the characters. I think that's what most of this video will be. It's no secret that characters are my favourite thing in any story. I talked about this in my Amazing Spider-Man review, and I'll probably talk about it again in future ones. But to me, Minus One's characters are exemplary. Right off the get-go, we are given everything we need to understand what we are in for, and given subtle hints towards the twist ending of the film, which was something I only really thought about on my third rewatch. But for the third and final time, I'll come back to it later. I don't want to linger on the opening of the film for too long, but I will say that I love everything about it. I loved seeing Godzilla in such a terrifying light, the despair and hopelessness on the repair crew's faces as they hopelessly try to defend themselves. It's not every day we get to see Godzilla having a battle with plain old regular people, and I think it's a fitting way to establish what this version of Godzilla represents. And when Koichi wakes up, the despair on Tachibana's face as he blames him for the deaths of his friends is harrowing. Koichi doesn't speak as Tachibana blames him for the loss of their lives. Like the rest of the sequence, he feels isolated, outside of the pack, as he desperately hyperventilates at the sight of the men who just yesterday were his closest allies. Everybody's dead, Tachibana says. They're all dead because you didn't shoot. We jump forward to their journey home. Koichi's still feeling removed from the sea of soldiers that are jammed together all around him. Without speaking, Tachibana hands him something. Pictures. Pictures that we don't see at first, but will be revealed later. This is a concept that guides the rest of the film. Pictures which dictate Koichi's fate. But after all, these aren't just pictures. They're memories. Memories which Koichi can never forget. We arrive in the bombed out slums of Tokyo. Koichi's home completely destroyed. His family burned alive by the fires that took it. We meet his neighbour Sumiko, and are told that her children met the same fate. Once again, Koichi is blamed. Look what happened because of cowards like you, she says. If you'd all done your duty, my children wouldn't have died. But even after taking the blame, Koichi finds himself alone once more in the bombed out wreckage of his home. A letter from his parents held tightly in his hands which reads, My dearest son Koichi, come back alive, alright? We flash forward again, and a woman on the run hands Koichi a child. He debates abandoning it, but can't seem to let it go. He stays there and waits, eventually deciding to bring it with him. We meet Noriko, a character who seems so full of joy despite her circumstances, a brief spark of optimism in this war-torn land we're experiencing. She follows him home, forcing herself into his life. We see that Koichi has clung to another memory, a shrine to his mother and father, the people that told him to live. The only character that makes note of the memory's presence, being the only spark of light in his life. Despite his reservations, Koichi is unable to push them away, and when morning comes, he is confronted by Sumiko again, the up until now spiteful woman begrudgingly doing all she can to help, unknowingly recreating the family that both she and Koichi had lost. Flash forward again, and things are starting to look far better. Koichi returns home, excited by the fact he's landed a new job clearing mines from Japan's dangerous waters. But when Noriko learns of the danger behind it, the wholesome moment soon turns sour. She forbids him to die, Koichi replying, "Don't worry. Just because it's dangerous, it doesn't mean I'll die." In Minus One, the concepts of life and death are constantly thrown around like orders. Even Noriko revealing that the only reason she keeps going is because her parents ordered her not to die. It's something that's so on the nose, yet so brilliantly woven into its narrative. An audible display of the opposing thoughts that plague Koichi's mind. Okay, so I want to go on a quick tangent, because I just have to say just how much I love Noriko, Sumiko and Akiko. They're such lovely, wholesome characters. Characters that always seem to bring Koichi a feeling of hope in whatever scene they're in together. Except when they're getting dunked on by Goji, of course. Sumiko becomes the mother he lost, always there for him when he needs that small extra bit of help, and a representation of the fact that the past can be forgotten. Noriko, as the captain says, is brought to Koichi by fate, a symbol of the life he wants to live, and a love story that is only ever confirmed in the literal sense during one scene. And Akiko is Koichi's hope for the future, proof that life can survive and grow in even the worst conditions. My favourite scenes in the film, except for the end of the Ginza attack, are when they are together, especially Koichi and Noriko. There's a subtlety to it. Two people so obviously in love that desperately want more from each other, but never seem to be able to utter a word about it. Instead, she's there for him no matter what, waiting patiently for his war to finally end. Finally, we meet the crew. Kenji, better known as Doc, Shiro, referred to the others as the Kid, and Seiji, the Captain. Two veterans, and a man who regrets never being able to try and help save his country. Once again, we are reminded of the war. Koichi losing control when the Kid wishes that it could have gone on for longer. However, even though we have just seen Koichi's rage, serving alongside them somehow becomes another positive in his life. We see a montage, one where Koichi's life continues to improve. The mission to remove the remnants of war from Japan's oceans, painted in a very positive light. Koichi's family grows as the crew become his closest friends and his new comrades in arms. Ex-soldiers who share the same horrible memories and dreams as himself. But then, just as everything is looking like it's on the right track, the memory returns. Godzilla Minus One isn't a story about a giant monster attacking Japan, and it isn't an allegory for nuclear war or ecological disaster. Even if Godzilla is still brought about by nuclear fire, he's instead just a representation of the guilt and trauma caused by the horrors of war. That's why, in my eyes, we get that look of his original unirradiated form on Oda Island. How else do you show the corruption of a memory without showing what it really was to begin with? In Minus One, Godzilla is a representation of Koichi's PTSD, an unstoppable reminder of how he failed to do his duty. A memory that continues to get worse the more he distances himself from it, and a symbol of how he himself remembers his last days at war. Why else is Godzilla so unstoppable in Minus One? Is it because he's a giant nuclear-powered monster able to regenerate at will? Or is it because he's a creature from his nightmares that is impossible to escape? One that is always chasing him no matter how far he tries to run? After all, as Koichi himself says, maybe it's his waking life that's truly the dream. When Godzilla attacks Ginza and Noriko dies, Koichi is completely torn away from the excellent mental progress he's been making. And when he screams in agony at the sight of Godzilla's destructive power, you truly feel his pain. Not because you've just seen a brutal monster attack, but because you've spent the entire time up to that point watching him get better, watching him finally want to live the life he doesn't think he deserves, only for it to be taken away so brutally. Before this point, we've already been told of his dreams, told that the men on Oda Island call to him, and that he feels he's supposed to join them. Koichi feels the need to die, feels that killing himself is the only way to defeat Godzilla. Noriko was everything to him, a woman he couldn't tell how strongly he felt, because he didn't believe he deserved his life with her to begin with. And until Godzilla is dead, until he is dead, his war isn't over. At the end of the day, he was still a failed kamikaze pilot that never completed his mission. Everyone dying on that island soon after because he couldn't even fire his weapon. Koichi may go to all the meetings, listen to how they plan to stop Godzilla, spend time with the child he's not even sure he wants to be his daughter, but the entire time, Koichi is once again isolated. Once again outside of the other voices that the rest of the film is throwing his way, distancing himself from everyone else in his life once more, the only thing on his mind being that he has to kill both himself and Godzilla, once and for all. Enter Tachibana. I said I'd come back to him, and how could I not? I love this character maybe just as much as Noriko and Koichi, yet he's barely even in the film. For almost the entire runtime, Koichi blames himself for the deaths on Oda Island, and believes that it was his inability to carry out his kamikaze that was the reason they all died. And by the time Godzilla returns, he believes there is only one man who can help him put a stop to it once and for all. The man his failure took everything from. The man who he believes wanted him to die, and wanted him to sacrifice his life in an attempt to save not just his men, but Japan as well. And that man is Tachibana. When Tachibana first returns, he's enraged. He hates Koichi. He beats him, ties him up, and leaves him for dead, only listening to him when he learns of what Koichi truly plans to do. On a first-time watch, this gives the viewer the impression that Tachibana wants Koichi to die, and that he always has. But on rewatch, not everything is as it seems. Tachibana's actions speak 1,000 words without ever being said. I love that when we are first introduced to him, that Koichi simply assumes everything about the man for himself. I love how Tachibana never says a single word to him about kamikaze. Never once asks him to die or berates him for failing to do so. All he does is comment on the fact that they couldn't find a problem with his fighter. In fact, as Koichi walks away, he looks distressed by the concept, but he's just as brainwashed as Koichi that he seems like he can't openly admit it. I love how when he asks Koichi to help them during Godzilla's first attack, it's not so he can die, but to save them. A 20mm can kill anything, he says. The only reason he chooses him to begin with is because he's the only one capable of operating it. If anything, he's rooting for Koichi. He wants them all to live so badly that when the plan goes sour and his men start shooting, he's the only one distressed by their mistake. Sure, he's angry at Koichi for failing to shoot, but he has every right to be. But no matter how sad he is by the deaths of his men, or how spiteful he is of Koichi, he never once tells him to die, the idea of which is just another false memory forced onto Koichi's mind. When Tachibana comes to Koichi's house, it's because Koichi tricked him there. He blamed him for the deaths on Oda Island, knowing that it was the only way to get his attention. For all we know, Tachibana just wanted to forget the war, to remove himself as far as possible from everything he remembered of it. But here is Koichi, falsely accusing him of events that, whilst concocted, are still falsely remembered on his part. Tachibana doesn't come out of spite for Koichi's failings. That spite never truly existed. He comes because of the lie, the irony of which being that Koichi's reasons for bringing him there were a lie to begin with. When Tachibana is repairing the Shinden, he notices the ejector seat almost instantly, and when he does, even though we don't know at first what it is he's seen, it's presented to us almost as a comfort, something that he's taking awe in. The entire time, Tachibana wants Koichi to live, and now he finally has the ability to make that happen. And by the end of the film, he does, giving him the order that only he can give, the order to live. Before I wrap this up, I want to come back to the film's use of pictures. Like I said, the film uses pictures as a symbol of Koichi's memory, of the motives he's facing during the different phases of his journey. I said already that the pictures of the engineering crew Tachibana gives him represent his memories of his failure during the war. But what about the rest? Akiko is always drawing, and like I already said, she represents Koichi's future and potential life. This is what enhances Tachibana's final scene with Koichi so much more for me. Tachibana sees the drawing Akiko has given him, sees the life Koichi wants to live, and in that moment, he finally finds the courage to tell him what he had probably wanted to tell him since the beginning of the film. To live. I know I'm going on another tangent, but trust me, it should all work out. Before Noriko is killed at Ginza, the doc takes a photo of her, a photo that soon becomes a memory. It's this photo that tells you everything about the ending of the film. You should know before the twist, before Koichi kills Godzilla, before you see Tachibana telling him to live, not just that Koichi has already made that choice, but that Noriko is alive and well. Disregarding the fact that we've already seen a representation of his future, a future which includes Noriko, the second he pins that photo of her to his dashboard, the photo which represents the one thing that symbolizes the will to live in his life, that's when we know everything is going to turn out fine. Koichi always found hope and support in Noriko, and even though he didn't know she was alive at the time, it warms my heart to know that he planned to live for nothing more than the memory of her and the hope that no matter what, everything would inevitably turn out fine. When I said I cried, it was when Noriko was in the hospital, and I hope my crazy ramblings about her place in this film make me look like less of a baby. Who am I kidding? I am. I also just want to quickly say that I love how the future is represented to us with the drawings of a child, messy and unintelligible, a sign that the future isn't clear. Is the ending cliché? In other circumstances, I might say yes, but here, I feel that so much is so subtly fed to us throughout plain old regular dialogue and physical cues, that I find myself looking past what may seem generic and finding a whole new appreciation for its narrative every time I watch it. Yes, there's sequel bait, but why wouldn't there be? It's a 70-year-old franchise consisting of 38 films. If you weren't expecting it to continue, then, to be honest, that's on you. Does that mean I want a sequel though? No. I think the film's perfect on its own, and I love the characters and their journeys too much that I wouldn't want to see them milked to death. If anything, I hope Minus One goes the same route as Shin Godzilla, a film so different that it doesn't need anything else. Yes, they set up that Noriko is infected with G cells at the end of the film. Yes, that sets up that other monsters will eventually appear in this universe. But who cares? Just because the film teases it, it doesn't mean it's going to happen, or needs to happen for that matter. If anything, that's just a representation of the fact that when one war ends, the next one is sure to follow. And to cap off my discussion about the ending, I've seen people complain about Noriko surviving, claiming that it's contrived that she was able to survive such an over-the-top level of destruction. But after all, she symbolizes life, and she was ordered to live. If anyone was going to make it through the impossible, it would be her. And how could she not? Fate was what brought her to Koichi, and who am I to try and argue against fate? So, why do I think Minus One is a masterpiece? Because it's so expertly well-rounded, so rich with detail, so harrowing, yet optimistic. Its character writing is top tier, its art design is exceptional, its soundtrack is magnificent, and its VFX go above and beyond anything that should have been possible for the team of that size. I never thought I would make a Godzilla review where I barely talk about Godzilla, but here I am. Although, I will say that Minus One's atomic breath scenes are by far the best in the franchise. Also, I still can't believe I'm about to say this, or that I've been saying it this whole time, but Minus One is easily the best Godzilla film ever made. And I don't say that lightly, because there are more than a few films in this franchise that I really adore, especially the original. And if that's not a good enough reason for why I'm claiming this is a masterpiece, I don't know what is. Anyway, it's about time I brought this review to a close. If you can call it a review, that is. I feel like I only talked about the characters. I didn't go too in depth with the monster action or the set pieces or really anything like that, but I'm just talking about what really made this film special to me, and I hope that I did a good enough job of that. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click that like button and subscribe if you want to see more content like it on the channel. And remember to hit that bell icon so that you never miss a video. I do all of this in my spare time when I get the chance, so seeing people actually like the junk I put out makes me want to continue. Sorry if that makes me sound like I have a colossal ego. I don't, but anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you on the next video.